This is just a little kind of quick slideshow to talk about a couple aspects of Hellenistic culture, just to kind of flesh out some of the details that the readings in this chapter, some of the issues that they address. I really just want to focus on religion and then a few remarks on literature. And really, what I want to focus on here, what I'm trying to bring out, is just some of the kind of characteristic elements of religion and literature during the Hellenistic period, and also just maybe some of the reasons for these changes. Okay. Um, Now, just to kind of set the scene for that, I think hopefully one of the things that's come out of your readings is the very kind of what we call cosmopolitan nature of the Hellenistic world. Now, what I mean by that is, of course, in the archaic and classical period in Greece, we were looking at the Greek mainland, Athens, Thebes, Sparta, that kind of thing. But now, of course, the Hellenistic world, as a result of Alexander's conquests, really do incorporate a vast part of the world outside of, say, the Greek mainland. So just to jump ahead here, remember, we're familiar with this map of the kingdoms in the wake of Alexander's death. But just if you think about this in terms of, okay, now what kind of constitutes the Hellenistic world? Well, before it was mostly just this kind of green area, but now it's all of kind of Asia Minor, the Seleucid Empire, which stretches right to the borders of India, and then basically Egypt as well, right? Now, this is called the Hellenistic world, as I mentioned before, because it is as a result of Alexander's conquest that we see the spread of Greek language, learning, and culture throughout this area. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in these areas, of course, are immediately speaking Greek. No doubt it would be mostly the ruling class and so forth, and the rest of the people just kind of went on living their, say, normal lives and speaking their usual language. But it does help circulate these Greek ideas throughout. So, for example, in Egypt, in the Ptolemaic kingdom, there was a number of what we call like official languages. There was Greek, kind of Egyptian, that kind of thing. Okay. So when we think about it in terms of the Hellenistic world, we think about the Greek world before it was just, in a sense, the Greek mainland. But when we think about the Hellenistic world, it's just a much more cosmopolitan world. Cosmopolitan comes from the word cosmos, right? And polis. So it's more this idea of the polis being the cosmos, everything, as opposed just to a small unit. So to flip back here, if we think about, say, classical Athens, it was a pretty kind of homogenous population. Most of the people, say, were born in Athens. They had mostly the same sort of beliefs and traditions and customs, religious practices, and so on. But now we're in this much bigger world, right? There's many more beliefs and customs, traditions in circulation, and they all are part of this Hellenistic world. So it's just much broader, expansive, and I just think cosmopolitan. I don't know if your textbook uses that, but it's a term that's often used of the Hellenistic world, and I think it's very appropriate, just because we see a much greater mix of elements. Let me kind of maybe try to explain this a little bit by taking a look at religion, because we're familiar with what we call polis religion, because that's what we've looked at, right? And specifically, we've looked at Athens. And remember there, of course, in Athens, they worship all sorts of gods and goddesses. But perhaps the most important one was Athena, right? And as I talked about when we were talking about the worship of Athena, it was one thing that kind of bound Athenians together. One thing that kind of held them together was the fact that they all worshipped Athena. And then when we have festivals such as the Pan-Athenaia, this week-long festival in Athens, it served as a kind of cohesive force to bring Athenians together. So religion, through one figure, Athena, could do this. And also, of course, so many of these religions had particular connections with the city, right? Athena and Athens. She's their patron goddess. So you can see then, as your textbook talks about, okay, well then what if, you're living in Mesopotamia or something like that? Athena doesn't have that same sort of connection to your city as she does in Athens. So that creates a bit of a gap there too. So some of these gods and goddesses in other parts of the Hellenistic world wouldn't have had the same sort of resonance. And of course, the other thing is that for a lot of these Greeks that are now living in a sense, kind of foreign countries in Egypt or whatever, they would have come into contact with new gods and goddesses and beliefs, some of which they may have been attracted to and some others that they wouldn't have been. So we start to see Greeks maybe experimenting with some other gods that traditionally they had no contact with, just because now they are in contact with him. Okay, so a few things that we can see here, just a few remarks, and these are talked about in your textbook. Let me just kind of build on them a little bit. One thing we see, of course, in all these places, we're going to have people still worshiping gods as they traditionally had. So people are still, of course, going to worship Athena and Zeus and all those kind of things. Don't get me wrong; those don't disappear. And the same thing, some of the kind of indigenous gods in places like Egypt and so forth, they didn't disappear either. But as a result of this mix, we do see some changes and developments that are reflective of this new kind of cosmopolitan nature. And when it comes to religion, one example that we see is this kind of phenomenon of syncretism, which means to kind of bring together, to grow together. And what this means is, for example, a lot of the Greeks who are now, say, living in Egypt, they would have recognized some similarities between their kind of own gods and, say, those in Egypt. And as a result of that, they may have started worshiping some of those Egyptian gods in a kind of Greek sense. The example that your textbook gives is Hermes, right? Hermes was often worshipped, especially he's the kind of messenger god in Greece, but he's also the god of kind of business and travel and stuff like that because he is a messenger. Now, the Greeks in Egypt, they recognize Thoth. That's the kind of Egyptian equivalent. So then what would happen is that they would maybe start worshiping Thoth as Hermes because they saw it as similar. Another similar example here is Zeus Ammon. We know Zeus, king of the gods, the sky god. Now, Zeus Ammon is kind of a syncretism of Zeus and the Egyptian god Ammon-Ra. Ammon-Ra is kind of like, in a sense, almost like the Egyptian Zeus, the kind of sky god, the kind of king of the gods. So what happens, we see, because of the similarities between those, and we see sky gods in lots of cultures, that they kind of join them together and worship them as one. So Zeus Ammon, all right? And here's an example of that, right? So he combines features of the Greek, especially the way he looks, right? And this part of it is more Egyptian, okay? So that's one thing they did. They just a lot of these gods have similarities from one culture to the next. So they recognize these similarities and then worship the gods as such. Another kind of interesting that happens is there's the creation of what we call new gods. Now it seems weird, right, to us to think just to invent new gods. But this does seem to have happened a few times. It's a little bit similar to what we see with syncretism. But rather, these gods are formed because kind of rulers, priests, and so forth, they recognize the importance of these gods for, say, social cohesion, other thing. So one that was kind of invented was one known as Serapis. And this is what he looks like. Now, what's interesting here is to say he's a kind of creation in Egypt that was meant to kind of partake of many different things so that he and his worship would be kind of as popular and common as it could be. So when you look at him, and I'll explain that on top of his head in a second, but you look at him, he looks like the depictions of Zeus, right? Or just an old kind of first generation Olympian god, kind of long hair, the beard, etc., etc. Now what he has on his head is a kind of a basket. And this is kind of represents, represents kind of abundance, because it's a container for something. But what also, it's a bit of an illusion, a visual illusion to the god Osiris, who is an Egyptian god of abundance and particularly of kind of fertility and grain. So the idea here is that it's a bit of a combination of Greek and Egyptian. Now, and here's another, there's a pendant, and you can see it's very, very similar. So here's the bearded figure and the kind of basket or kind of bucket on top. And the aspects of the god of Serapis are very appealing because they're very general, right? Prosperity, abundance, of course, who can find fault with that? So he had broad appeal in that way. And the idea was that these new gods would appeal both to, say, Greek speakers and Egyptians and others. In other words, they could kind of cross those boundaries and be kind of bring people together that way. And the worship of these gods, especially Serapis and others, became very, very popular, right? So here is a picture of the Serapeum, which is the complex that at which Serapis would be worshipped in Alexandria. And you can see it's only been kind of partly excavated, but it's a huge complex, which, as I say, just maybe conveys the importance of his worship at this time. Another thing that I find really interesting is a greater emphasis on gods that had, of course, been in, say, the Greek pantheon, um, or kind of common enough in a lot of these cultures, but just take on a new importance. And one of these is Tyche, or Tuke, or whatever. There's different ways to pronounce it. And it basically translates as fortune, good fortune. And we see depictions of this. All right, so here's a picture of fortune. And you can see it's very, what's often depicted with her, you can see in her right hand, she has a sheath of wheat. So that too depicts fertility and abundance. And then on the top of her head, she doesn't have a basket like Serapis does, but she has, it's kind of tough to make out, but it's like a little city, the walls of a city. And what that kind of conveys is that she is the protectress, or the protector of cities. The success or the failure of a city depends upon a kind of the good favor or the lack of good favor of Tyche. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is, why is it important that fortune becomes more important in the Hellenistic period? And I think this has to do with some of the other changes that are happening at this time. Remember, in the classical period, life was tied in the independent polis, Athens, Sparta, and so forth. And there was a lot of security there. Small communities, your family's going to be there. There was a bit of security there, right? But now, in this much bigger world where the government doesn't take as big an interest in your life, there is this sense that things aren't quite as secure, that there isn't some sort of protection or care. The community wouldn't kind of take care of you. Now, I'm not saying this is kind of applies to everybody, but it's a definite thing that we see developing. So people aren't quite as secure in their circumstances, I guess I should say. And as a result of that, what becomes more important is fortune. Because if you're in an uncertain situation, well, what do you wish for? Well, you wish for good fortune so that your security will be assured. So this is why things such as Tyche and worshiping good fortune become so important. And a related thing is, so I'm getting ahead of myself here, is we start to see the rise in interest in cosmology and astrology, kind of reading charts and so forth. And this could be understood in the same sort of context. Because if you think about it, if we're thinking about astrology, kind of reading your future or your situation by the paths of the stars, what you're basically trying to do, now, of course, there's many ways you can do this, is to kind of bring your unstable life, if you will, right, or your day-to-day life into some sort of relationship with the unchanging cosmos. Right? So that too, kind of like the worship of Tyche, it's a way of trying to provide security for yourself, or direction, or kind of rooting for yourself in this kind of new turbulent world. So you can see, when it comes to religion, I don't want to give you the impression that things completely change and people aren't worshiping the older gods and so forth, because that's still happening. But what you want to see are some of the new developments and what these stem from. And I think here, when you focus on things like Serapis and Tyche and astrology, those are things that really help you understand the important changes in the Hellenistic period. Okay. The last one I want to talk about is literature. And here, this is going to be pretty quick. Your textbook talks about some good examples, but let me just I'm sorry, in slideshow on the visual arts, I kind of allude to literature and so on. But here too, we see some important changes, and I think you have to understand it within some of the changes in social structures and political structures. Because if you remember in the classical period in Athens, when we took a look at tragedy, all right, or history, and even going back to Homer, some of these kind of grand genres, right? Homer talking about these great battles of the past, of these heroes that lived long before us, who are kind of bigger and stronger than everybody and who mingled with the gods, right? Or tragedy, which through myths would explore great political issues like the development of the homicide court in Athens in the Oresteia. So these are all works that really engage what it meant to live in a polis, right? Or they dealt with huge themes, great heroes, and so forth. Um, but what happens is with the changes in the Hellenistic world, right? Less interest in kind of governance by everybody, right? That is, governance was now kind of turned over quite often to professionals. And with some of these other changes that I've talked about in connection with the religion, there is just a bit of a shift in focus and change in interest of what people wanted to see. People no longer wanted to see these kind of, or I should say, see as often some of these great tragic plays. They wanted more escapism. They wanted something that dealt more with the day to day. And this is one of the characteristic features, and there's many different features of Hellenistic literature. But this change in focus to more everyday themes is a very common one. And perhaps the best known person in this regard is a playwright known as Menander. You can see his dates there, 342 approximately to about 290. Now here's a bust of him. Who knows if it looks like him, but all right. Lots of depictions of him. Very, very popular. Wrote a lot of plays, about 100 comedies at least, but very few of them survive. We only have about 2 that are almost complete, and then we're dealing with a lot of fragments. But we have enough left, and we also have enough discussion of Menander by the ancients themselves that we can reconstruct some of the plots and his style. Now, Menander is referred to as New Comedy. Now, this is versus the Old Comedy of the 5th century. Now, we didn't really discuss Aristophanes, although he is in your textbook. He is the best kind of example of Old Comedy. It's comedy that dealt with political life in Athens, so it dealt with democracy and so forth. So in other words, it's the kind of comedic equivalent of tragedy. So that's what we call Old Comedy. Not very original titles, right? But now this New Comedy, to distinguish it, they give it a new label because it's not as interested in affairs of the polis. Rather, what we're really interested is in maybe interpersonal relationships, escapes, love stories. In other words, you don't want to deal with the big issues. You want kind of light entertainment. Now, that might be an oversimplification, but it maybe conveys some of the changes. So let me just explain this to you by taking a look at probably the best preserved play of Menander I have. It's called the Dyskolos, which roughly translates as the grumpy old man or the grouch, right? I think isn't there a movie called Grumpy Old Man? It's kind of like that, right? Now, what you have to understand is, for a typical play of Aristophanes, he wrote one of his famous works is called the Lysistrata. And in this play, it takes place during the Peloponnesian War, so Athens versus Sparta. You may have heard this because it's been in the news a lot in recent years, especially with conflicts in the Mideast and other places, that the women of Athens and Sparta are so upset at all the deaths during the Peloponnesian War, the absence of their husbands and so forth, that they decide to go on a sex strike, right, and withhold sex from their husbands until peace is agreed upon. So although it's a very kind of comedic situation, and there's lots of laughs and of course lots of sexual innuendos and jokes and all that stuff, so it's very funny, but it deals with war and peace and this bloody conflict between Athens and Sparta. So it's dealing with a very serious issue. Okay, so that's kind of Old Comedy. But now the Dyskolos, the grumpy old man, basically let me just kind of give you a really streamlined synopsis. Basically, we have an old man, the grouch, Kinemon, right? And he lives on a kind of rundown farm with his daughter and a servant. And what happens is this young man, Sostratos, he wants to marry the daughter of Kinemon, but all sorts of kind of obstacles are put in their way. People try to convince Kinemon that Sostratos is a good mate for his daughter and all those kind of things. So basically what happens is, I'm really simplifying here because they get very complicated with especially all the Greek names and so forth. But what the play basically works towards is this grouch, right, the very beginning of the play, not being friendly with everybody and so forth. And then what we work to at the end of the play is in fact a marriage between the young man and the daughter. So we go from a kind of negative beginning, right, with this old man on his farm, to a big party at the end where there's a marriage and a big celebration. So you see this love affair, people getting along, that kind of thing. And it usually has to do with like, we also see another common theme is you have a grumpy dad that doesn't let his son have a relationship with some other young girl, so they have to kind of circumvent him or trick him in some way. So you can see it's supposed to be kind of happy. We think of romantic comedies where, the couple gets together and in the end there's a marriage and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of like that, right? So they're dealing with kind of exploring relationships between people and that kind of thing. So there's not just the seriousness that there is in old comedy. And again, this should remind you of the slideshow on the visual arts, where there was a kind of a similar turn to kind of escapism and enjoying some of these tales that say weren't as serious. And I think even in modern culture, we can see the same sort of thing, right? Excuse me. That sometimes people just like this, not this kind of change of pace, if you will. So they're just talking quickly about Menander, and there's other people I could talk about. It just gives you a good sense of how some of the interests have changed and how it's connected to political changes. Okay, so hopefully this material combined and supplemented with what's in your textbook will give you a sense of some of the important cultural changes that are taking place in the Hellenistic world at this time.